Now, rating agency Fitch says African nations like Ghana, which have credit rating of B and stable outlook, will not default in repayment of debts despite rising debt levels. Ghana's debt to gross domestic ratio hit about 71% at the end of September this year, after borrowing about 273 billion cedis. Now, addressing investors on the outlook of sub-Saharan Africa sovereign and debt markets, head of Middle East and Africa sovereign ratings, Jan Frederick, said the COVID-19 pandemic has brought some element of risk to Ghana and other sub-Saharan African nations, but these nations are capable of repaying their debts.
To look at the countries that are currently at CCC, which are Angola, Cabo Verde, the Republic of Congo and Mozambique. And all of these countries now have debt ratios above 100% of GDP. And our definition of CCC essentially means that the risk of a default is a real possibility. Most of the other sub-Saharan African sovereigns are rated at B, which means that there is a material risk of default, but a limited margin of safety remains. So we are certainly not expecting defaults for this region, but we need to emphasize that, of course, the crisis has meant that risk levels are really exceptionally high. And it's also worth emphasizing the role of the international financial institutions in potential routes or paths towards a default. The World Bank and the IMF have recently been particularly clear that they advise all countries where debt levels are already at unsustainable levels to try to restructure that as soon as possible.
Well, let's discuss this further. Joining me via Zoom is Yao Latte, head of the advisory unit of Deloitte Ghana. Thanks for your time tonight. Great to see you. So Fitch is optimistic about our ability to repay our debts on time despite rising debt levels. Do you agree with that assessment? What's your thinking?
Yeah, thank you very much. So from the assessment by Fitch, it's clear that we have reached levels where it raised concerns, and the IMF, the World Bank have raised concerns. Usually when your debt levels reach about 70%, it raises a lot of concerns, particularly to multilateral agencies and the international organizations. So once we cross the 70% mark, 70% debt to GDP ratio, international partners raise those concerns. But that said, I think in Ghana, we have particularly been in a situation where we have the ability to pay our debts. There are a number of factors or certain things that support our debt repayment. And one of them is our commodities. So our commodities have always benefited from downsides in global economies and then also benefited from upward swings in global economies. So as we speak, we know that, let's say, demand for oil has gone down. But the benefit that we're also getting on the other side is that we have very strong demand for gold. And the price of gold has stayed at above $1,900 per ounce over the last 5 months or even more. So it means that we have some commodities that can support our revenue generation. If you recall, when we opted for the HIPIC initiative, our debt levels was above 70%, but our debt to revenue was over 500%. Currently, we don't have that situation. So it means that if we improve our tax collection efforts, domestic tax collection efforts, we'll be able to get out of the woods. It is not a situation where we cannot come out of. The problem we have is that as we get into elections and also try to recover from the pandemic, we are spending on other recurrent expenditure, which are coming at the expense of other things like capital expenditure, which support our long-term growth. But otherwise, I think we are capable of servicing our debt, but the debt service levels will come at the expense of other things like capital expenditure, which should support our long-term growth.
You raised the issue of taxes. We'll come to that in a bit. But I just want to ask you, because yesterday we were reporting that the IMF and the World Bank are going to do an assessment as to whether we are debt distressed. Right now, we are at a risk of debt distress. So in the middle of next year, sometime next year, we're going to have that assessment made. What do you think would be the outcome?
So as at July, I mean, we were around 70% debt to GDP ratio. So we would say that we were showing signs of debt distress You know that there are other African countries like Zambia that recently reported their distress levels, which got some of their creditors moving in for their sovereign assets, which is a worrying issue. But we haven't gotten there yet. But from July to date, we do not know how much has been spent and how much has been incurred. So that's the challenge we have, that as at the time, as of July when it was reported, we were more than 70%, but we do not know the situation now.
All right. And so let's go back to the issue of taxes, because there have been suggestions that any government that assumes power may want to introduce more taxes to make up for our rising debt. Now, Deloitte, you've done an assessment of the first quarter budget estimates as presented by the finance minister last month, and you're cautioning against that.
Yes. So I think increasing the tax rates or increasing the tax burden on the existing taxpayers is just overburdening those who are compliant. And I think if you continue to push that, people will become non-compliant. So the way to do it is to continue the effort at bringing people into the tax net. One of the efforts is using digitization. Government has strictly enforced the implementation of the tax identification number system, where you cannot even file a case in court or open a bank account without a TIN or a TIN number, they call it. Those are very good policies, and we expect government to continue or strictly enforce that, and not just have people present the TIN numbers and not follow on with the tax collection, because people do not even file their tax returns. And we expect government to strictly enforce that after you've gotten the tax identification number, you should also be able to present your tax filing certificate and all of that in bidding for government contracts and so on and so forth. When that is done, our tax collection effort will increase. It means that we have the ability to collect a lot of taxes internally, but we are not doing that. And in areas that we are not collecting taxes, such as property taxes, like we've said before, we are not doing well. And so it means there are monies that we can collect, mobilize domestically to support our budget, but we are not mobilizing domestic revenue, and we are always falling on external debt. That's the problem that we've had.
And your concern is that it would derail the recovery of businesses from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in terms of business recovery, how successful do you think the Ghana Cares program will be? I know you guys touched a bit on that. Talk to me about that and what direction you think that program should take.
Yes. So in principle, the CARES program was structured as one of the well-structured programs, we must say. So we have the short-term activities which have been undertaken by government, most of the recurrent expenditure, support for business and so on. And we have the long-term aspect, which is long-term funding guarantees for businesses. So government set aside, let's say, 2 billion cedis as guarantee for businesses to borrow from the commercial banks.
Right.
We think that if government increases this guarantee fund amount and so on and so forth, business will be able to access more and recover. If government increases taxes, businesses are going through the recovery process. So any attempt to increase taxes or impose new taxes that government has removed and classified them as nuisance taxes, they will adversely affect the recovery process. And so from now to the first quarter of next year, we expect the situation to remain as it is, but government should focus on widening the tax net or bringing as many people as it can into the tax net, as opposed to imposing new taxes.
Always great to have your intelligent analysis on our program. Yalate, grateful for your time. He's the head of the Financial Advisory Unit of Deloitte Ghana.